So I've been receiving a lot of questions from different engineers, architects, and developers about what to do with the agentic systems that they have right now. If they should go ahead and switch over from the current language models that they're using to go into DeepSeek. That is what we're going to be addressing in this particular video. So there are several things that you have to consider when you are building agentic systems. So the language model is a very important part of this. The framework is another important part. The memory design and all those things are very important. But the language model that powers, that is sort of like the reasoning system and the engine behind the entire system, is a very critical factor that you have to consider. And in a separate video, I created a checklist or a framework of analyzing all these different language models over a certain set of criteria before you can decide what to use for your particular application. So I encourage you to take a look at that video. I'm going to put it in the description of this one so that if you need to go over that, you can take a look. That is the criteria I'm going to be using to evaluate DeepSeek R1 and DeepSeek V3 as we think about using it for any agentic system that we're designing. So to get started, when we are building these agentic workflows or systems that have multi-actor setup and configuration, we typically need to break it up into multiple pieces where you have different pieces doing a particular subtask that is part of the overall vision or goal of the agent. So to do this, you need to take a look at what language model should I pick for different portions and things like that. Now, the first thing I want you to understand is that the reasoning ability and the ability for it to evaluate what it has generated is very, very important. If a language model does not do this, then it's not good. The good news is that DeepSeek is able to do this. It has the ability to understand input if it is in the language that it supports, so English or Mandarin, and it can reason, and it is able to go to its database or the information you've provided, and is able to analyze it and generate output. You can also use DeepSeek V3 or DeepSeek R1 to parse or to validate or to do reflection on what you are about to send out to the user or what you're about to send out to the as a response. So DeepSeek V3 and DeepSeek R1 are able to do this appropriately. Now, besides the ability to reflect, besides the ability to reason, it also has language support if the only languages you're using is going to be Mandarin, Chinese, or English, and that's it. And this is a problem. So if you have a scenario where you need to provide support for multiple languages, and the language model has to understand these input languages like French, like Portuguese, like Spanish, like Italian, like Russian, like any other language that other language models support, then you can run into a problem where you're not able to use DeepSeek. So before you switch from your current model provider to go into DeepSeek R1 or DeepSeek V3, you have to make sure that the language that you're going to use either as output or input into the system is supported. And if it doesn't support it, then you're going to have to use DeepSeek alongside a different language model that has the capability of understanding and generating content in that language before you can bring it into your agentic system. So language support is a very critical criteria, and there are scenarios where DeepSeek might not be a good fit if the input language or the target output language is not supported by DeepSeek, which currently, as of the time of this recording, it only supports Mandarin and English, and that's it. Any other language, you're going to have to bring in a different language model to use alongside DeepSeek, maybe perform some kind of translation into Mandarin or English to make it work. But that just increases the complexity of the application, and it's not something that I would recommend you do. Next thing is going to be tool calling. This is one reason why I would say you should not use DeepSeek. If you have the need or the requirement to retrieve data from external systems or perform actions like inserts updates or deletes to external API systems or databases, tool calling is not something that is currently supported by DeepSeek R1 or DeepSeek V3 at this time. It is something that you would have to use DeepSeek maybe with a different language model, and it cannot be used by itself. So tool calling is not supported, and the ability to interact with remote APIs or databases is something that is missing in the language model as of the time of this recording in February 2025. Maybe in the future this might be added, but as of this time, I would not recommend you switching from other language models that support tool calling, function calling, or the ability to interact with remote systems just to get to DeepSeek and then get disappointed when that is not supported. So tool calling is missing. Structured output support is also missing. This is necessary when you have these different agentic systems that have multiple actors that work in steps, where the output from one step or one phase of the agent or one phase of the workflow or one node in the graph of the workflow is being used as input in a later stage or a later phase of the application. So if you have the need to generate output from one step where you expect certain fields to be present, where you expect certain data structures to be adhered to, and certain data types to be adhered to, and then that is needed as input for a subsequent step, then this is something that DeepSeek cannot do at this time. So if you still need to use DeepSeek to generate the output, you're going to have to bring in a different language model and incur additional costs and setup to parse the output from DeepSeek into the preferred or the expected data structure to make this to work. On its own, DeepSeek does not support this. So if you use a different language model, maybe the ones from the Llama series, that might work for you, or use OpenAI O3 mini or O1 mini or O1 or O3 or whatever is available at the time of you watching this video. So on its own right now, you cannot use DeepSeek R1 if you expect to pass along very strict data structures to subsequent phases of your application because structured output is not available. I've also seen a scenario where the responsiveness of the endpoint is not satisfactory, particularly with applications where there is an expectation by the user that the language model or the agent will respond almost immediately. So if you have this kind of scenario and you're using maybe a remote endpoint or a service provider for DeepSeek that is kind of overwhelmed because of the popularity of the system, then you might end up with scenarios where the system is not responsive enough to support your use case, and your users might end up either frustrated, or the application might end up timing out because the endpoint is not able to respond appropriately within the expected SLA. So this is something that you have to pay attention to when you are deciding to go with DeepSeek, particularly if you are running your apps in Azure, but the endpoint is somewhere else, which I completely recommend against doing that. Responsiveness is very important. The context windows from some of the providers are also not sufficient to support the expected input token and the output token size, as well as the context window to allow you to preserve history if you're doing chatting, either by text or by voice. So think about this before you switch, because if the context window is not broad enough to support the history of your transactions, to support the input size of tokens you expect to put in into the request, or the expected output token size that you want to generate, then you might not want to go with DeepSeek, because it will, in certain cases, the context window is very limited by some of the providers, and this is something you have to pay attention to as you are evaluating these systems. One more thing that we have to pay attention to is that I see people do this a lot with some of these cool demos. It really makes me cringe when I see API keys scattered through the entire applications. They put it in .env files, they put it in the shell scripts, they put it everywhere, and then sometimes this ends up being discovered by people that are bad actors and hackers, and it is not a good situation to find yourself in production. Everything that I teach you here has to do with designing, implementing, deploying, and maintaining these AI applications in production. Not for you to be doing cool demos to your friends and colleagues and customers, but to deploy it in production, where you have to be responsible for what happens after it is deployed and after it has been created. So security consideration is something that you have to put at the top of your list during the design, implementation, and maintenance phases of your application lifecycle, because every AI application is an application. So the software engineering principles and architectural design considerations is something that we should not just discard because now we're doing AI. We always have to have that mindset and make sure that the security considerations are at the top of the priority. So what do I mean by this? Make sure that you can use managed identities to authenticate with the system, and you don't have to use passwords or use API keys or API tokens and be passing it around like a joke. So make sure that managed identities can be supported. So this can be user assigned managed identities. They can be system assigned managed identities. This eliminates the need for you to have to provide credentials like API keys, which can be easily hacked. If you take a look at the news recently, over 1 million API keys from customers of DeepSeek, the hosted version, were exposed by security researchers. And this is a very big problem. You don't want to be in this scenario in production at all. So make sure that whatever authentication and authorization mechanism you're using to communicate with the endpoint for DeepSeek allows you to use managed identities to do that. And with the Azure model catalog through AI Foundry, you can do this, and that simplifies things a lot. Another thing is that I strongly recommend against using DeepSeek or setting up DeepSeek outside of Azure or outside of the private virtual network where your environment is running. So there are certain industry certifications and scenarios where you have to run the language model endpoints in the same network privately as your applications. So we cannot go out of the network or use publicly available endpoints to interact. So if you have this kind of requirements for healthcare, for financial service, for education, or any other government environment where you need to maintain very strict security considerations, then using the publicly available DeepSeek instance will not really be compatible with this use case. So make sure that you can use managed identities to authenticate and authorize the application. Make sure that it is possible for you to deploy the DeepSeek endpoint in a way that is private and not public. That is very, very important. Make sure that you have the ability to observe who is using it and how many times they are using it, and you have the ability to enforce constraints like quota enforcement and things like that. This is very, very important when you're doing this in production. When you're doing the cool demos, you don't really have to worry about this. But in production, you don't want to be woken up by someone in the middle of the night because something was hacked or something is being used and the metadata or the traffic is being snipped by bad actors. So you don't want to have that kind of experience. So those were the 5 major things that I wanted you to pay attention to and think twice before you just switch to DeepSeek as your language model provider for your agentic workflow or system. The other thing is that I see that there are scenarios where it is not easy to deploy a DeepSeek. So I want you to get out of the habit of always using a browser or using a tool every time you want to provision your language model endpoint. You have to find a way to automate this and have it as infrastructure as code, where everything is editable, allowing you to roll forward or roll back if you want to go back to a previous state. So if you have the ability to deploy your language model endpoint either using Azure Bicep or Azure ARM template or Terraform modules to do that, then I strongly encourage you to use this kind of strategy. If you're using DeepSeek outside of Azure and it's not something that you can control or maintain, then you don't really have this ease of integration and deployment. And it's something you have to think about, because always think about the maintenance part of this application and not just getting the cool demo working. There are also several hidden costs with regards to using DeepSeek outside of Azure or using DeepSeek as a hosted instance where you are the one responsible for running it on virtual machine scale sets, or Azure Kubernetes Service. If you have to do this yourself, consider the cost of hiring the professional that is able to do this DevOps setup and provisioning of the environment. So the human resources cost has to be considered, the infra cost of setting up the hardware to do this, the networking, the egress charges, the storage cost of using persistent storage through the premium storage, and all these different things are things you have to consider when you think about just switching from a particular service that you have access to today to just going to either doing the self-hosted or using it outside of Azure. That was everything I wanted to cover with you. I'm just going to do a summary right now. DeepSeek allows you to do reasoning and reflection very, very well. It is very good at doing this. It has limited support for English and Mandarin. And if you have the need to use any other language, either as the input language or the output target, then DeepSeek may not really be a good fit for this scenario. You might have to combine it or replace it with a different language model that has these capabilities. And definitely, as of the time of this recording in February of 2025, we don't have support within DeepSeek for tool calling, for structured output support, and some of the endpoints are kind of slow and not able to carry the expected number of tokens per minute. The context window from certain providers are very limited, and it does not allow you to keep a large amount of history in the chat, or if you need to send in large input or expect large output tokens to be generated, it does not really support that. And some of the security setup is very, very scary, and I want you to think about that when you are choosing DeepSeek for that kind of deployment. And there are hidden costs, and sometimes it's not easy to provision it. So that was everything I had for you in this particular video. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone else you think will benefit from this type of content. And I will see you in the next video, and I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for your time today.